so good to be back in this thing. I've done some very essential but basic and not unheard of modifications to this car. If you've heard of a General Motors Gen 4 V8 being customized and tuned before, this is certainly nothing new. Essentially what I've done is a brand new intake, full exhaust and tuned to 98 octane, and that's it. It's basically just opening up all the restrictive factory parts and improving the volumetric efficiency of the engine. That's how much air it can actually take in, and then you can inject more fuel, make a bigger boom, make more power. That's it. Nothing GM V8 specific either, just an essential for any car that could really benefit from those very basic modifications. What I do want to talk about, however, is the transmission, because yes, you can tune a transmission. And what do I mean by that? Well, to break many hearts, this here is a good old automatic. They're all real slush box, really just indecisive and slow from factory. This thing shifts so hard now, it actually lurches forward and sometimes even chirps the tyres as it grabs the higher gear. It's absolutely crazy. It's totally changed the car. So how do we do that? How does the transmission actually work that out? I'm going to spare a bit of an anatomy lesson here and we'll just talk about the basics. Essentially what we're doing is changing how the gears are grabbed, and they're basically done in these automatics by use of a multi-plate clutch pack and a brake band. Yes, you heard that right, automatics do use clutches. We use hydraulic pressure from the automatic transmission oil, and they're directed by use of valves and solenoids. Old school cars that are more mechanical, they'll use a bunch of valves, and you can adjust how much pressure the oil pump makes with an adjusting screw. We're in the 21st century here, so we don't use these mechanical valves. What we do actually use is solenoids, which basically use electricity to create a magnet and then use that to open up these valves. After filming this, I had the chance to service my friend's Toyota 86, which happened to need an oil change for his transmission. Don't worry, I've told him off for having an Auto 86 too, but at least it gives me the opportunity to show you the solenoids I'm talking about. These are what control the pathways to clutch packs and servos for brake bands. The solenoids are commanded by a transmission control unit, and that's what the tuners can mess around with. They can change the timing and how much these solenoids open. In this case, we're modifying the computer's parameters to increase oil pressure, thus creating a more aggressive shift between gears. From a factory, obviously the manufacturer has to appeal to the general population. So what are the benefits of tuning a transmission here? Well, the first and obvious one is it's faster, okay? Faster is faster, it's a performance tune, it's the whole point of doing that. That's the main thing. The other thing is actually now being able to handle the extra power the engine now makes. So I'm going to talk about those clutches and brake bands here, and I'll use the brake band as a very good example. Essentially their principle is the inverse of a drum brake shoe. They have the friction material on the inside of that curve, not so much the outside, and a drum shoe is actually meant for dragging along and slowing down the wheels of the car. That's your brakes. Your clutches and bands in a transmission aren't built to have that dragging for too long. They're used to hold on to gears, and that is how you get your different ratios. If you want to look into that, look up a planetary gear set. It's what automatics use. I think it's an absolute genius system and very well appropriately named too. So if you look up planetary gears, you'll know what I mean. With the brake band, there's a very, very thin friction material on that as opposed to a drum shoe, which has a very thick friction material. And drum shoes are very interchangeable. They're made to be replaced all the time. They're a very, very serviceable part. The thing about these clutches and bands, like I said, they're supposed to hold on, is when you build friction for too long, they start to heat up and they start to wear out. And you can actually get to the point in a brake band as well where the adjustment comes out and it doesn't hold a gear properly anymore. And that's when you start to get slip in a particular gear. You can, in some systems, adjust that brake band, which is fine, but if you lose too much of that friction material or it goes completely out of adjustment, you lose the gear, you lose the band, and it's a transmission apart job to replace it. So not very good. The other thing is, that'll build a lot of heat, building a lot of friction, right? And that's going to tarnish your oil. Automatic transmission fluid is a wonderful thing. It is responsible for lubricating, and it is responsible for this hydraulic pressure, which we use. It is so easy to tarnish with that sort of heat. By reducing the shift time, by opening up these solenoids quicker or more, we can actually reduce that shift time, have less time actually creating friction. So that's pretty cool. We like that. You get a better handling transmission and you get a faster car. We like that very much. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves at this point. There are a couple of drawbacks. Obviously there's going to be a drawback with everything that you do. So the first thing is, obviously we're putting a lot more stress through the drivetrain. That's the gears in the transmission, the drive shafts, prop shafts, the diff, all the way to the wheels. They're going through some greater forces. The thing about torque, you know, that magical thing that's rotational energy, is it finds the weakest point in a system. So if it's not your tires that are going to be slipping, then all that force is going to then break the next weakest thing, which could be any of those components. That's why when you see cars that have all-wheel drive, the drivers won't launch them as hard as they possibly can, because they have so much more of that tire grip. They don't want to stress out the rest of the drivetrain. So we've got to be careful with how we actually shift and change the transmission in that regard. At this point I'm going to say it's super important to pick the right tuner as well. Like I said, this is a V8 Commodore. There's probably at least 100 of these tuned and modified every single day across the country, and the people that I went to work on these cars every single day as well. So I had lots of recommendations for them, and I was pretty confident in their work. I'd seen plenty of it before, and it was pretty sound in my choice. So very happy with it, and it's all acting pretty good so far. The other thing is the serviceability and costs of the car. So I've had a few recommendations from people that because we're now sort of putting more forces through it, it would be a good idea to change the oil a little bit more often. This has a service interval of, off the top of my head, something ridiculous like 120,000 kilometers. Although anyone that's worked on these cars has said that's way too far, and the oil just comes out black whenever you do it. So that's not a good idea. I would just do it earlier than that anyway. But I've had sort of people say around every 40,000 kilometers. The other thing about that though is I don't drive this car much anymore, and I certainly will be hitting the time interval of the service interval far sooner than the distance. So that's not an issue for me, but it's something else to consider as well. The other last and final thing is obviously the shifts are a little bit harder, and they are noticeable even when putting around like this. So for the general consumer, it's a little bit more uncomfortable. I don't really notice, it's not that important to me, and it just feels so much more ready to go. Again, I like it a lot more. If I've still got your attention at this point, I want to talk a little bit more about what I said in picking the right tuner. And for me, the people that I went to did a couple of things to the car that I didn't even ask them to do, but they know it so well, they did them anyway, and I'm very, very happy with them about it. So what are those few things? Well, firstly, very common these days, this has a soft rev limiter, so when you're in park or neutral, it only revs out to 4,000 RPM as opposed to the red line of the engine at 6,000, which you don't really need to do, but it's nice to be able to do it. So again, they didn't tell me that they deleted this, so I got home from the tuning and gave it a bit of a blip in the garage and got the shock of my life when it nearly hit red line. So that was exciting and cool, and just something I didn't expect. The other thing is, again, if you're familiar with your Gen 4 General Motors V8s, is it has the wonderful cylinder deactivation. So basically when you're under light load and you're at cruising speeds, it'll actually shut down 4 of the cylinders. You're then running just a 4-cylinder, it's supposed to save more fuel. That's great. If you're running a V8, any hint of greater fuel economy is a very, very welcome thought. However, if you're an idiot like me and you decide to modify your car, then it sounds great when all 8 cylinders are firing, but as soon as it cuts out those 4, it sounds like an absolute droney wet fart. That is not an exaggeration, it sounds disgusting. I honestly thought I'd ruin the car. That's not even the worst part though. The worst part is the official specs of this car is that the manuals, which don't have the cylinder deactivation, have a better fuel economy than the automatics, which do have the cylinder deactivation. So it's basically a useless system in that regard too. There's a whole host of other complaints about it too, but fundamentally, they're the 2 things that just don't make any sense. So anyway, they got rid of that too, and now it's just firing all 8 cylinders all the time. It sounds great, and I don't really spend any more fuel. Well, I mean, now I do that it's been tuned, but relatively I didn't really see much of a difference. It's still slow to react when you want to change. Like, I'm going to shift from second to third now. Ready? There's like a good second delay, but the shifts themselves are great. Otherwise, that's all I've got to say, and I really just want to thank the lecturers that was able to have a conversation with, because if I hadn't told them I was just getting this car tuned in general, they wouldn't have started talking about whether I was going to get the transmission tuned as well. I wouldn't have thought about it as much, and it was something that I hadn't really heard of doing before, so I thought it was a really cool thing. You do hear it very often that tuning your car is the best bang for buck modification that you can do, because it just changes everything about it, the characteristics of it, the way it drives. I've just fallen back in love with this car, and I hope it just inspires anyone on the fence about tuning to, you know, think about doing it, because if you're gonna have your car for a little while, or you just want that little extra pizzazz in your car, it's just totally worth it. So that's the whole point of the video. If I've missed anything, or you think there's anything that you could add that might be, you know, worth talking about, please do leave a comment, because I'd love to talk about it too. In the meantime, I'm just going to enjoy the rest of this beautiful drive through these hills roads. Tunnel, 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 tunnel.